All right, to Syria now, where a car bomb has killed U.S. troops on a routine patrol. The blast happened in Manbij in northern Syria. Now, let's remind you, just weeks ago, President Trump said he would withdraw American forces from the war-torn country, claimed that ISIS had been defeated. According to Turkish news, ISIS has claimed responsibility for this attack, and this attack comes on the same day the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, declared also that the terror group had been defeated. Take a listen.
We're now actually able to begin to hand off the fight against ISIS in Syria to our coalition partners, and we are bringing our troops home. The caliphate has crumbled, and ISIS has been defeated. Now, we'll stay in the region and we'll stay in the fight to ensure that ISIS does not rear its ugly head again. We will protect the gains that our soldiers and our coalition partners have secured.
All right, let's get straight to CBS News senior foreign affairs correspondent and the moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan. She's joining us from Washington. Margaret, so this is pretty, I'm not sure what to make of it. The vice president is saying ISIS has been defeated on the very same day that ISIS killed American soldiers there. And according to David Martin, if it turns out that that the four, in other words, if there's not more that have been killed, even these four would constitute the largest loss of life for U.S. service members going back to 2015, since the United States first appeared on the ground there. It just doesn't, I mean, if you're family members of these fallen service members, what will you make of the vice president saying ISIS has crumbled?
It's an extraordinarily tone-deaf statement for the vice president not to have acknowledged those deaths that also include some seriously wounded U.S. service people. As you said, this is potentially the largest loss of U.S. life since the U.S. began its involvement in Syria. Just to be clear here, there have been thousands of our allies who have died, Kurdish and Arab fighters. Remember, they are the boots on the ground. The U.S. is there providing intelligence, aerial support, guidance on the ground. So up until now, the U.S. has minimized its losses. This is extraordinary in terms of the timing as well. I'm sorry, I'm told there's a microphone issue. Can you hear me, Vlad?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So it's an extraordinarily large loss of life, and that is what is so stunning here. For those Blue Star families wondering about their loved ones now potentially becoming Gold Star families if they do have loved ones lost in this blast, they have to be wondering why the vice president would say something like this today. What he's trying to do is underscore the president's policy, because it's clear the U.S. won't walk it back. The Trump administration just wants to bring out those 2,000 U.S. troops and 24 diplomats who have been there and serving in this support role. But what is also interesting in what the vice president said is he, after saying the U.S. is pulling out of Syria, said we would remain in the region. He is assuming there, what my understanding is that U.S. troops can remain in Iraq. Now, the U.S. has said they want to stay there, keep the 5,000 troops in neighboring Iraq, but we haven't yet seen the Iraqi parliament sign off on that. So that is not a sure thing either. So the vice president is making a few assumptions here, and he may have made a misstep by not acknowledging the loss of life.
No, it's an incredible point that you make, Margaret. And yes, certainly the allies and the partners on the ground have lost thousands of lives, as you mentioned. But it does strike me then that this loss of life of U.S. service members, on one hand, as David Martin suggested to us, the president might be able to say, this is exactly why I want to pull us out of Syria, because I do not want a loss of life of American service members. On the other, it does point to the fact that certainly you have reported, and others, David, that ISIS has been defeated in many pockets of Syria, but it is by no way ultimately or completely defeated.
Right. How can the president say ISIS has been defeated when you've seen the largest loss of U.S. life since the U.S. became involved? The two ideas seem contradictory, certainly. He would say this just vindicates his decision to pull out, but what it underscores is that the calculation isn't quite so clear. What often you hear senior American administration officials describe as the defeat of ISIS is in terms of the territorial control they once had for the caliphate. Remember, ISIS was declaring that they had their own country, essentially, this country where they ran the government. They had their own laws. They had even their own educational system there within the borders of this area they carved out of Syria. That has been reduced to just about 1% of what they once held. That doesn't mean the idea of ISIS has been defeated the same way that the idea of al-Qaeda didn't die with Osama bin Laden. This is an idea now that they have become an insurgency. And that is why senior U.S. officials like the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, who resigned when the president made this decision to unilaterally withdraw, was concerned that the U.S. would be leaving a vacuum too soon that could be so easily filled by those who are still insurgent forces, supporters of ISIS, who may not be running their own government but are still remaining behind the scenes and looking for opportunities to exploit.
And finally, Margaret, again, just to underscore the point that you made about the thousands of lives that have been lost in Syria, I want to know what the United States is saying about the Kurds in the region. Part of the reason why members of Congress were not all supportive, and this was bipartisan, of this removal of U.S. troops, is for some of our allies in the region, right, and what it means for Turkey and President Erdogan of Turkey, how he's going to treat the situation. I know that he's been warned by the president, but maybe you can unbundle that for our viewers.
Right. Well, as the former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said, you do things with your allies, you don't do things to them. And this is what happened to the Trump administration. By making a unilateral decision, you did something to your allies that left them wondering about U.S. support, left them wondering about the coordination. Because remember, this was a U.S.-led coalition of 74 countries that were working together to try to defeat ISIS. And the U.S. was at the helm of that and providing the bulk of funding and support, but they weren't alone. Now you're having other countries like Saudi Arabia foot more of the bill for some of the things like reconstruction within Syria. So this was not just a U.S. effort. And so for the president to just say, we're gone, it leaves the rest of those countries in an alliance wondering, well, do I have to follow through with the check that I promised to write? Do I still have to do these things? And frankly, the U.S. and some of our Western allies like France and Britain are uniquely qualified to be able to do some of the things related to removing IEDs, bombs. Remember the migration crisis you saw in Europe with refugees
yes.
flooding in, fleeing the violence? They were fleeing safer territory. If you're asking them to go back to Syria, back to their homes, and it's still not safe, they're not going to do that. So that was one of the theories where diplomats like Brett McGurk, who recently resigned from the administration, were trying to push through. Let's remove the bombs. Let's try to do these things to let people go back home. The northeast part of the country where this happened, in Manbij, is within the territory along the Turkish border. And some of our Kurdish allies, and it's a mix of different fighting groups, but they ethnically primarily are Kurds, have been left wondering about America's support on the battleground. It was always a controversial decision for the United States to back them up. Remember, the Trump administration decided to arm the YPG, one of the Kurdish fighting units within Syria. That was the administration's policy, to help them out. Then to say, we're gone, leaves them wondering. It also puts us in this bizarre situation, frankly, where our allies in Turkey, NATO allies, are wondering what's going to happen here if the U.S. is pulling back. Does that put them in a way in confrontation with the mainly Kurdish groups there, the YPG and others they consider terrorists? Does it put them at odds? Does it leave the U.S. in a position where they could even be fired on in the next few weeks and have to make a decision as to how to push back on a NATO ally? It creates, the way this was done without structure, order, and a timeline creates so many possible complications that people are trying to untangle the policy rather than carry out a policy here. And that's just not a way that the Pentagon certainly likes to do business, and certainly not diplomats.
And Margaret, we're so grateful that you were able to join us on the air to untangle it for us. I always learn a lot when I speak to you, and I'm sure our viewers do as well, because this is a very complicated issue with a lot of nuance, and you've shed some light on it for us today. We really appreciate it, Margaret Brennan, moderator and host of Face the Nation. Thank you so much.